Hi, this is Filiberto Amati, and I'm here for a new session on the state of fashion and startups disrupting the fashion world. I'm here today with my partner in crime in this series of chats, Elisabetta Borghi. Welcome, Elisabetta.
Hi.
And our esteemed guest is Amy Ayrton. Hopefully I said that correctly.
Yes, you did.
From LOOPED. And we are going to be discussing about this emerging startup, their vision, and how they think sustainable fashion can be further promoted and developed on a global scale. So welcome everybody, and Betty, first question for you.
Hi, Amy. Nice
Hi.
to meet you today.
Yes, you too.
I just wanted to ask you if you can tell us your story. How did you meet your co-founder, and who is Loop?
Yes, definitely. So two co-founders, Hannah Stanton and Martina Soggi. So Hannah and I actually grew up together in a small little beach town in Australia. So we've known each other since we were about 6. And we sort of went to primary and high school together, so we've known each other a very long time. But I moved away and went to New York for many years, and I was working in the fashion industry there. So I was working for a brand there in production and operations, and on the logistical side of the brand. I moved over to London just a few years ago and reconnected with Hannah, which is where I met Martina. So Hannah and Martina had actually formed an NGO together. The NGO was based on promoting sustainability within the fashion industry specifically. So the three of us have always been united by our passion for change. I started working with them with the NGO when I moved over to London. And I just found it so inspiring that I've always worked in the fashion industry, and I've always loved it. But there always has been a slight conflict in terms of the environmental impact and what that means. So it was very inspiring to be connected with creatives that also shared that vision and shared that passion for changes that could be implemented within the industry. So we came together with this NGO, and the three of us have all come from backgrounds in fashion and design and sustainability, and we felt increasingly discouraged by the industry's habit of just using the word sustainability and making commitments, but not making a lot of actual changes, and which is what we were sort of campaigning for. But instead of campaigning for end consumer change, we wanted to instead sort of provide an alternative solution that could be established and be utilized by both consumers and by brands, and just to provide an alternative circular structure as opposed to just campaigning people against what they were already doing, which is, and we met a lot of designers that were also inspired by this and were working in this space, which is what really inspired us to create Looped. And we fundamentally believe in the power of creativity and the creative minds that's working in the fashion industry. And these creative minds will play such a vital role in how the industry can move forward into a more sustainable future that is really required. And this is what we can sort of really harness and utilize to change that societal view towards waste and the industry's views towards waste, because really the industry is structured at a point that it allows this amount of waste to be created through multiple aspects of the production process. So really working on changing that perception of what textile waste is and how we can sort of creatively utilize that into different channels. So we're really just looking to create a community of these like-minded designers and brands who share this passion and share this vision for us of a separate, more circular system.
So may I ask, what is then exactly, or what are the multiple business models that you are embracing with Looped?
Sure. So the primary business model is, so Looped is an online marketplace for upcycle designers. So upcycling by definition is to utilize existing products and materials in their current form to create products of a higher value than the original components. So it differs from recycling in the sense of a lot of recycling will involve either chemical processes or energy processes to break down fibers to be made into new fabrics, which is great because it's not creating any new virgin fabrics, but still quite a few of these processes can be very energy heavy and chemical heavy, which can still add into the carbon footprint of that particular fabric, which then needs to be cut and sewn, which then needs to be made into a final garment. And there can be international shipments required in between each of those stages. So upcycling instead just focuses on those individual materials in their current form, which isn't adding into any further carbon impact by that particular product. So it's the most sustainable thing you can do in the industry at this time because it's utilizing them in their current form. So we have a marketplace which is working with, we've got about 200 designers that's working in the upcycling space at the moment. And the marketplace itself is like a direct-to-consumer marketplace. So it's connecting these designers that's working in this space with conscious consumers who are sort of interested in this upcycle product, which there is a growing number of them. But we'll be launching simultaneously with the marketplace of brand collaborations. So for us, we really believe that for the industry to get to where it needs to be, that collaboration is key. It's not just going to be individual companies' changes or individual concepts. It has to be something that we come together as an industry and as a society to work towards the solutions that we all need. So the brand collaborations we see as a perfect opportunity for that, to be connecting brands that have excess materials, or maybe they're damaged stock, or we've spoken to quite a few brands so far, and each of them, the materials available are completely different depending on the brand. But it's facilitating and connecting collaborations between these brands that have this excess material in stock and designers that's able to creatively utilize this in a way that isn't just going to be them putting it into landfill or them having to sell it to a TK Maxx for a very discounted price that might be impacting their positioning. So it's allowing brands to, one, creatively utilize it, and two, show that they are making concerted efforts to the company's impact itself and to be rethinking what they're doing with that waste. So it will be both a direct-to-consumer model as well as the B2B aspect of the collaborations as well.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. Betty?
I enjoy a lot the part of corporate sustainability that involves the production of textiles or big brands with waste, with the connection that your marketplace is creating between the designers, so they re-put into the process of production those parts of material, and then they regain a value and arrive to the consumers. Could you tell us more or less what are the advantages for a designer and also for a consumer to when they come to your marketplace? What is your uniqueness?
Sure. And I mean, well, from a designer perspective, for the upcycling designers specifically, a lot of them at the moment are selling on a varied platforms. Some are selling directly on Instagram. Some are selling on Depop, which is another traditional reselling. Some are on Etsy. And there's a few others that's selling on other sort of wholesaling sites. But a lot of the time, the feedback that we have received, and we can see this ourselves when you just look on the sort of the product offering on a site like Depop, is in traditional resale platforms, the price point of that is a bit lower than what you would wanting to be sell at something that is handmade and unique, and a lot of hours of work are being put into it. So a lot of the feedback that we got was that designers felt that they were having to devalue their creations in order to fit into the price point that's suggested for some of these, or selling directly on Instagram, which is a very manual heavy process, and the communication back and forth each time you're trying to sell a singular product. And then again, being negotiated down each time because people don't understand why you're charging the price that you are if they don't understand the story and the work that goes involved in it. So for us, one of the key aspects of the marketplace is the power of this, of telling the story and providing the designers a space to talk about the workmanship that went into it and say that it came from 6 separate pairs of jeans that they pulled together to make into this one jacket, and it took them 6 hours to do this stitching, or any of the particular details of their craftsmanship can be really highlighted to show the beauty of it, but also to allow them to be able to be charging the correct price for what's needed for the amount of work that they've put in. And then from a brand perspective, with the changing consumer opinions and beliefs towards sustainability, traditionally what brands might have been doing with this excess material, I mean Burberry came very famously under a lot of fire for burning a lot of their excess stock and a lot of their excess materials. Some are selling through to TK Maxx, so they would traditionally be doing sample sales, but a lot of this has been changed, one through COVID, and two through changing consumers' opinions. That we can't, brands are now held responsible for their waste and what they're doing with that. So for brands, it's a huge opportunity for them to be creatively utilizing it without having to implement whole teams in order to create their own upcycle collections. It's instead just another alternative channel for them to be reutilizing this waste. And a lot of the waste that would even be interested in working with is sort of small offcuts. They can't necessarily be sold. It's under 10 meters. It's an awkward shape. You can't do a full size run in it if you're creating a product. So there can be limited things that they can do with it. So it's just providing another alternative solution for them to be reworking with this, as well as then showing to consumers that they actually care about the environmental impact and that they're making active changes to change their production process, as well as supporting upcoming and established upcycling designers.
Let me ask a question concerning what you just said, and let's focus back on the platform of what you are building. Because in terms of laddering and benefits for your brand, on one end there is this unique piece, a lot of work, craftsmanship, extreme, tailor-made, and on the other end, there is the dimension of, and it's upcycling.
Yes.
So how do the two benefits play in the duality? Do they reinforce each other? Do you need to build each other? How do you make them both believable from a pure branding point of view?
Yes, I understand. I think for us, the value comes down on the quality of the products to be really listed on there. I think traditionally, upcycling previously through sites like Etsy and a few other things has had some negative connotations towards being a little bit crafty and a little bit homemade. So that is the real emphasis that we're working towards, is elevating the concept of upcycling to be at the quality that the designers that we're working with are at, that they are at that luxury. They are at that luxury quality level, and they're making very high quality and beautiful, unique garments. So each of the designers that we'd be working with, we are going through a vetting process for each of them. It's sort of a 3-step vetting process, and we'll be vetting each of the products, especially in the beginning stages, to ensure that that same quality standard is across the board, because we need to ensure that the price point of the hand workmanship is also in line with the quality of the goods themselves, and to just allow that people can have confidence in the products that they're purchasing from there. And just because it's upcycled or made from recycled fabric doesn't take away from the quality of the garment itself. So I think that's going to be a really key aspect in the marketing and positioning for us in the beginning stages, which I also think the brand collaborations come into play with that as well, because it's showing the caliber of brands that have this material available, which in itself, I think from an end consumer perspective, will assist in helping that confidence level within upcycling.
Thank you.
What are the advantages in case you are a fashion student or an emerging designer?
Sure. Well, so fashion students especially, it allows them a platform to be working towards, and almost as an aspirational sort of aspect to be looking at the collaborations that would be able to potentially work with if they were onto Looped. Again, as I mentioned, that the quality is a very important aspect for us, so we vet at the beginning stages. But for a lot of designers that are still studying through school, if they are creating these pieces at the side, it can almost be a very good supplementary income for them as well. You know, that there's a lot of designers that are currently making these pieces, and they're not necessarily having the channels in order to sell them in the first place. So I think, interestingly, the more we researched into the designers that we were initially interested in, the more designers we actually came across that weren't traditional upcycling designers per se, the only thing that they did, but upcycling was what they were doing in their own time, in their own houses. So I think the more that we are elevating that concept of upcycling, the more designers that we will actually be able to sort of come into contact with and bring in, because there's just so many people working in that space at the moment.
In terms of your relationship with the designer, so is this also a brand building platform for them? Is that a way for differentiating themselves and launching, or it's just a channel, a route to market that they wouldn't otherwise be able to? What's your vision?
Our vision is to, just as you exactly described, to really have it as a platform where they can launch themselves as reputable upcycle designers. It's a very important aspect for us, and each of the designer profiles, once established, really will allow them to sort of have their own online showcase of all of the work that they've created, as well as a bio and information about them. So to allow them to really show their work as a whole, as opposed to just individual pieces. So making sure that the designers feel supported and feel that they are able to really launch themselves for it is very key for us. The community aspect of Looped is one of our very core principles that we're really working towards. So creating a community of like-minded designers and eco-conscious consumers, because they're really just looking to create and connect people that share this same vision and passion. So we definitely working towards the designers feeling as supported as possible. Initially, our plans were to be doing physical events as well, where people can be meeting the designers, seeing the high quality of their garments. Those have been put on the back burner for the time being, but definitely we'll move towards some virtual events and in the interim until we're all able to finally be in a place together. But the community aspect is extremely important so that end consumers can meet these designers and to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it and the process that they went about it. And people can just talk and share ideas, because even the more designers that we're speaking to and connecting the designers with one another, it's just it becomes such a creative hub of energy of people just working in the same space and sharing ideas and sharing vision. So that's definitely something that we're eager to build, and as much support as we can give to the designers. We are looking towards at a later point, we're pushing it back to sort of end of our second year, but what we're really interested in doing is collecting and saving materials that would have ended up in landfill, and collecting those to then stockpile them, to then close the loop and provide these back to the designers. Because a lot of the designers that we come into contact with in upcycling, it can become quite time consuming and quite energy heavy to be sourcing all of these materials. And it takes up a lot of their time and energy, and it prevents them from having the space to actually grow their business and grow their brand. So for us, what we'd really love to work towards is collecting these materials that they would have the capacity to utilize in such a creative way, but might not necessarily have the capacity to be able to source it and find it and to stockpile it. So we'd really like to be getting to that point, because for us, the success of Looped is completely linked to the success of our designers, and our product is their success on the same note. So it has to be a positive for both aspects. So the designer support is one of the most important things for us.
Also, because on the other way, if you think about it, you just said it, no, it's your success is their success. because your point is that you're doing all this effort to make sure that these textiles get a real, textile life, and they don't end up in a landfill or being reprocessed, shipped around the world to be reprocessed. So
Exactly.
if you don't close that loop, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Completely. And
From a
that's also
purpose point of view, even.
couldn't agree with you more. Like that's our biggest, we say that our overarching mission is to reduce textile waste. That's our end goal. All of the decisions that we make and all of the additions that we're looking to add on to our business model and growth for future is for that end goal of the reduction of textile waste. So whatever we can do to get to that end goal, and to get to that end goal with a community of people that feel not only included, but feel the same passion and drive to getting towards that end goal that we do.
Betty?
We discussed about how much is easier for a designer to come to your marketplace, saving a lot of time because they just can surf your product description and buy what they need. So it's making the process much easier and quick. What about the other part? During the last couple of weeks, we talk about cryptocurrencies and NFT and the power of blockchain and so on. From the fashion point of view, how is important the technological side and the traceability aspect in all the process of production and supply chain?
Well, yeah, traceability is obviously key. And coming from a production background myself, it's not always the easiest thing to track, even from a brand perspective, when you can't necessarily track the supply chain of the fabrics that you're buying. But from an end consumer perspective, it's almost impossible, especially with you tracing it back to sort of the root of where the initial fabric was grown in the first place. It's an almost impossible thing as an end consumer to be able to trace that back. So transparency, I think, is a key in any sustainable business model, to allow that complete transparency for end consumers to see what that supply chain looks like and where it starts and where it's heading to. So for us, the transparency is really reliant on our relationship with our designers to ensure that they are truthful into where they're getting their materials from and and the individual, to ensure that they are producing the goods themselves. But blockchain is a very interesting one, and looking at what the blockchain could mean from a fashion perspective, which a lot of brands are trying to incorporate that at this point. From upcycling, it can be a little bit difficult, because if you find materials that aren't labeled, or if you find goods that didn't have their care tag or the fabric on them in the first place, it's very difficult, time consuming and expensive to be able to track what the individual components are in each of the fabric components that you're using on a product. So when it's looking at the impact of upcycling, majority of the time it's just considered that once the materials are collected from waste, then that is considered as 0.0, or the first round of their supply chain. But for us especially, transparency from that point onwards needs to be as clear as possible as we can be with our end consumers. So again, each of the products that is listed on there will include the products or the t-shirts or the original components or whatever was used by the designer, and providing the space for the designers to show this information for them as well. So as our overall mission is to reduce textile waste, and the transparency is going to be a key aspect of that. So transparency across all processes of our company, whether internally going through the process of B Corp certification, as well as the transparency of each of the products that will be listed on the site. So we'll be providing the designers with the capacity to be able to say where each of the individual components was sourced from, and the processes that they've used in order to produce these end garments, and really providing the space for that transparency across each of the products that's listed on the platform. So transparency in itself, I think, will have to be one of the fundamental aspects of Looped in order to provide that clear reasoning to any of the end consumers as to why they would be choosing upcycling over a brand new product, because you're giving that given that overview of, from the initial components, how many pieces have been saved from landfill. So when we are working towards collecting of materials from manufacturers or from textile waste from vintage stores or wherever the material is coming from, we're really looking towards calculating all of that information to provide that to the end consumers so they can really gain an understanding of exactly the amount of textile waste that we're really working towards reutilizing and saving, and then ensuring that the transparency of how that's done is communicated clearly through all of our channels.
And I think this is actually great because there is few articles that McKinsey has published in the past few months, especially post-pandemic, where they discuss about the resilience, the importance of resilience of supply chain in the new normal. And this resilience starts with transparency, because part of the issue, part of the post-pandemic, let's say, or during pandemic problems from an economic point of view was also due to the fact that certain industries stopped because their supply chains were completely blocked, and they didn't know that their supply chains were so dependent on China. They didn't know they were so dependent on Asia or a certain type of transports, and so they couldn't operate. And you had, automotive suppliers in Italy that they couldn't supply their car manufacturers in Germany because they were missing parts that tend to come from Southeast Asia. And they didn't have that kind of visibility on their business. So transparency, it's key from a consumer point of view, but it is also from a B2B point of view.
Exactly. And I think COVID really brought that to light. I mean, if you look at the example of even in Australia, the largest producer globally of wool, what we realized during the pandemic is that there's no yarn processing plants here in Australia at all. It was normally the wool was shorn, sent over to China to be spun into wool, and then brought back here to be knitted. So it's really brought to light the multi-steps of the supply chain and how a lot of those aren't necessarily sustainable when you have international transportation that's required between each step of the production of a garment. I mean, you can get to a garment in a store in Australia and it's gone through to 5 or 6 separate countries before it's even an end product. So COVID really brought that to light, where I don't think that was ever part of the mainstream conversation before about all of those steps. And especially you touched on workers' rights, which has become a huge forefront since the COVID epidemic as well. And people are just becoming more aware of the supply chain and the impact of the individual products that they're purchasing. Because from that same McKinsey report, that they were saying that 2/3 of consumers are now saying that it's even more important to limit climate change now after COVID than prior, because people are sort of realizing the impact of each of the individual products that's sitting not even in our clothes, but in our homes. Everything that we own is going through those same separate supply chains. So it's really calling a lot of those into question.
Yeah, and I think that, Betty and I being in Italian, we always think about made in Italy, and the made in has always been a gravitational pull in certain industries, wine, fashion, food, whatever. But the truth is that made in is also becoming a filter in certain industry to remove from your preferred bouquet or consideration bouquet certain garments, certain products, certain items. But the problem is that consumers are also realizing that the made in is not necessarily as transparent as possible, because you could package a shirt in Milan and then it could be labeled made in Italy, but then it's actually designed, produced, knitted everywhere else but in Milan.
Exactly.
So it's critical that we, and of course, this is a process which was, slowly happening. But as you said, the pandemic was a huge accelerating factor for people to make the transformation and make the realization. And now if you try to buy masks on Amazon, healthcare masks or medical masks, I think that the country of origin comes first, and then the type of mask comes later, because that's what people search for. They want masks made in Italy, not masks made in Sweden. I don't know.
And as it should, there should always be an emphasis on localized production, because it not only supports your local area, but it's minimizing any of these unnecessary shipments between multiple countries, because it just doesn't make logistical sense to be shipping something by plane halfway around the world to have one section sewn to then be sent somewhere else for dyeing afterwards. It's not logical, and I don't think it is something that we can continuously do. And it's interesting that you touched on that, because also there's been such an increased conversation around environmental impact and with workers' rights, and especially through COVID. And it has been a build-up over the past few years, but unfortunately, the fashion industry is still producing 4% of the global total of carbon emissions, which is the same as Germany, France, and the United Kingdom combined. And it hasn't actually shown any net reduction, even though there's been greater conversation around it. So it's really calling into question exactly how we're going about our production processes and this linear structure that the whole industry is set up on. And that changing of that linear structure and more, closing the loop is really something that we're going to have to work towards in order to try and make any actual impact.
Absolutely. Betty?
There's also another point that might be considered nowadays, that are the increasing costs of logistics. I have been surfing the web regarding this new emerging issue, that there is an inflection of costs because of the increasing traffic, and we cannot risk again to stay without our supplies. LOOPED in a certain way is trying to build up and empower our local entrepreneurship in Europe, or in the future, hopefully in other countries. What do you see the current situation regarding the consumer side? During the last years, e-commerce boomed, especially during COVID. What do you think it is changing in terms of consumer behavior, not just in terms of sensitivity regarding the local production or the sustainable production of a product, but also in terms of behavior, in terms of shopping? When do you want to buy and purchase a good?
Yeah, well, you touched on quite a few interesting points there. So firstly, with the localized hub of production is something that we feel is very key to a sustainable business model, which is why initially we will just be launching within the UK and EU. So we'll be working with designers who work within that space from materials that have been rescued from that particular area to really create those localized hubs. And we, of course, would be looking to expand geographically, but that would have to be at a later point, because we'd need to be then setting up separate localized hubs for North America and for Australasia and for any other places to really work within that local community with those local artisans and with the local designers working in this space from materials from that particular area that would have ended up in textile waste. Because, again, as you touched on, the supply chain being so interrupted and moving between all of these separate countries, the impact of that is can't be ignored and can't just, I think from an end consumer perspective, we are so used to having anything we want at any time that we're not used to having to wait for it to be put onto a boat instead of it to being put onto a plane, or to be waiting that extra period, or, and that's something that I think we as consumers will need to work towards. I think there's a huge shift in consumer attitude and behavior towards sustainability and upcycling. It's been a drastic change within the past few years that I think can be felt for majority of brands, that they need to be incorporating some level of sustainability within their business plan. The difficulty with that is because it has become such a hot commodity for consumers, brands do have the capacity to sort of be using words as opposed to actual actions, and to just be swapping out a fabric with an organic cotton and then having that to be their sustainability offering. But it's up to end consumers, I think, at this point still, to be able to have the capacity to look into each of these products to be able to determine if it's truly sustainable and if it's not. So that's something that I think will be a key aspect. And I think, a huge portion of consumers are now saying that sustainability is a very important aspect. It's something like 70% of consumers state that the sustainability of a product is a factor that they consider when they're looking before they purchase. When you're looking at the shift towards online and the sort of the hollowing out of the retail market, which again, I think has been really accentuated through COVID. We've seen department stores being completely emptied. There was a statistic I was reading the other day that was saying that there's 125 million pounds worth of stock that's been left over from the last spring-summer collection in the UK alone. So the retail market as we know it has completely shifted during this time. So again, it's the perfect opportunity to be launching something like Loop, to be creatively utilising this stock and to get away from this continuous seasonal structure that we've had within the fashion industry for such a long period that's not sustainable. Something shouldn't be on sale just when it's only been in store for 2 months because we have the next drop coming in. It's unnecessary. And I think, while I'm hoping that more consumers will be open to this seasonless approach and more just working towards buying products when they're needed, as opposed to having these set seasonal drops and the heavy discounting, because retailers can't sustain it, brands can't sustain it. People aren't buying to the same level as they were before. So the whole structure of seasons that we currently have is it's in the perfect position now for that whole model to be questioned.
And if you think about it, it's actually, it is really a self-destructing cycle from a pure business point of view and economic point of view, because they start working and sourcing 18 to 25 months before to be able to have the garments in stores, and then they invest in pushing rotation because they have the stores and they need to look at stores profitability. So it really doesn't make any sense.
No sense. And even coming from a brand perspective, when I was working in brands, it's like brands can't even keep up with that amount of production either. We can't, to come up, especially if you're just a small team, be coming up with new collections 4 times a year it's not sustainable from a creativity perspective, especially for small teams, and it's not sustainable for large scale in the amount that they're producing anyway, because you just can't, we're not moving those amount of units anymore. And especially with the transition towards all online, it's going to completely question, I think, a lot of that structure that we have had, because it just doesn't make any sense. It's just producing too much. That's just, yeah.
So do you think this might accelerate actually move back to the tailor-made and custom-made?
There seems to be a shift towards that with a lot of the designers that we're working with. They have noticed that their people are more open to those smaller one-off and unique pieces like that. It has seemed like there's a consumer shift towards there. I also think it will mean that brands are more perceptive to potentially working with collaborations like this that traditionally might not have been looking at doing upcycling or to be reutilizing that, because as you touched on before, brands and all companies within the industry are really having to diversify the business models and structures at the moment, because if you're just relying on one particular structure, it's not sustainable, and you can't hold up to any amount of change that happens. So I think it's a huge societal shift as well, not just within the fashion industry, but society as a whole. And I think the fashion industry has a lot to answer for and a lot to change. And especially if we're to keep on target with the UNCC outlines of the Paris Agreement, we have to change things drastically. We only have a few years in order to get that change really to be where we need to be to stay on target. So yeah, hence why we find collaborations key, because it's not just going to be, it's not just, we can't be just one company coming up to completely change everything. It has to be all companies and all collaborating together creatively to put in as many changes that can possibly be implemented, so we can all work towards getting to reach those the pathways that's required.
Thank you. Betty?
You say that LOOPED is based on the concept of community, because it's your core. You are born in this way. How do you think to engage not only designers, but also the consumers of your platform?
Sure. So our marketing strategy will play a very key role in that. So we'll be looking towards an omni-channel approach to just have as many touch points as possible. So for us, we really think it's important that to educate and inspire the community of consumers that we have in the endpoint, to just give them an indication of, a lot of people still aren't familiar with the supply chains of the fashion industry. They might not be as familiar with the impact that fast fashion is having and that all fashion is having within the planet. So if we can educate in a way that can be conversational and approachable, as opposed to lecturing, is really what we're working towards. So engage our audience in as many ways as possible. So this will be, obviously physical events when we can ever possibly do that, as well as we want to be having masterclasses with our teachers with our designers, so they can really have an understanding of the workmanship that is involved in each of the products, and also to include them in on that process to provide them with the tools that they would need. So we really need just as many physical touch points as possible with our end consumers, to just make sure that we're inspiring them so they can understand what our mission is, why we have it, and then so they can be as inspired by it as we are.
Let me ask a question concerning your experience as a startup, because basically Betty and Amy, you know each other because of the startup bootcamp. So how it is to be part of such an important accelerator and program, but doing it remotely during a pandemic? How difficult and demanding, and what's the value you're getting out, and would you recommend it or not to other startups in any other industry?
I couldn't recommend it highly enough. So it has been extremely challenging, especially with working remotely, but we are one of 12 startups which are in the program, and we're one of the few startups that actually aren't trading yet. So for us, to gain the level of understanding and knowledge that we've been able to acquire through this course prior to trading has just been absolutely invaluable for us. We really got in just on the concept of what we were trying to achieve, and we actually got in, they say, due to our passion for the actual cause and the idea itself. And so we've been able to formulate our concept from just being such a loose concept that we just felt very strongly about, to being a fully fledged business model that we're preparing to launch. We couldn't have done that without the support of this program and through mentors like Betty. It's been such an amazing experience, especially with 3 female founders. This is our first startup venture together. So it has been a steep learning curve. And the biggest difficulties that we've found is that because we are working remotely, we're lacking a little bit of that the energy that comes from being surrounded by a room of people that are working towards goals and having that face-to-face meetings and the energy that comes from that, you learn and grow a lot more and you can network a lot easier. So obviously the Startup Bootcamp has digitized everything of their offering from the whole accelerator program, but it has been a little bit difficult to sort of connect with the other startups and their other members, because I think that is a really important aspect of networking and growing, and each of the startups can then be learning from the others' mistakes and passing on feedback and sort of really growing from that. And so it is all digital at the moment, but everyone's having, the same kind of issues at the moment of how many Zooms can one person have. But we're all in this together, and it's been such an amazing experience. So yeah, we're finishing up in a few weeks, but I couldn't recommend it highly enough.
And I
I'm
think
sure
it's
that we're going to have a good future.
yeah.
Thank you.
But I think it's a very relevant, point of view and experience. And I myself guided a couple of startups I advised through their process, and there was always incredible value from the networking with startups from other industries that have heard of an idea that you haven't heard about, or have a contact in a country you don't know anybody, and of course that digitally doesn't come very well, but today it is what we have, and we make the most out of it.
Exactly. We just have to get up, we do the best we can. So
Betty, sorry, closing remarks, closing questions?
What are your projects after this acceleration program? Are you thinking to launch something in particular first?
So our first major goal is the development and launch of the marketplace. So obviously that is our biggest main hurdle for this point. But coming from production operations backgrounds myself, I'm really interested in the collecting of materials. I'm specifically interested in the collecting of materials from manufacturers. So they're saying that there's like 60 billion square meters of fabric that's produced every year, and about 20 billion of that ends up on the cutting room, or like 2 billion of that ends up on the cutting room floor. It's a huge amount of fabric that's left over. I'm really interested, which is where I first wanted to come into Looped to focus on, is that material collection. But obviously we have to take things in stages when we're sort of launching, and to just start with the core aspects and then to be growing on that. So as soon as the startup is up and launched, that is going to be the next key goal of how we're going to manage the logistics of collecting this material, stockpiling it, having it, how we can digitize that in order to have designers to have access to it without having to physically come into the space, and then how we can work towards having that material to be stockpiled, and then potentially, if depending on how much material we can be collecting, of diversifying the revenue stream to have that material to be available to other designers or brands that aren't specifically listed on Looped, but collecting this material from people that have it there but might not necessarily have recycling that's available to them close hand. They might not have a list of designers that would be interested in purchasing it. So simplifying that process for them to get it collected, and then for us to be able to finding people who can actually utilize it. So that would be that's our next really big goal once the marketplace launches.
Are you involving also textile outlets?
Yeah. For sure we will be. So even from textile outlets, so a lot at the moment would have excess fabric that can't be sold, or if it's just there's samples that's left out on the floor that they might have had out and might be slightly damaged because so many people have been touching it, or whatever those details are, but definitely fabric outlets as well.
Cool. Amy, it's been really a pleasure, and we wish you the best of luck in disrupting the fashion industry and making it more sustainable, hopefully, for everybody, especially for my kids' sake, since they are the one who are going to be inheriting this mess
Exactly.
we are creating. So I thank you for that. And Betty, thank you very much. Amy, was a pleasure, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
See you.